All right, well, hello everybody. Me and Mark are part of a meta-analysis project on counterproductive work behavior. Uh, we thought that today I would start us off by going over some information about counterproductive work behavior and the scale that we're particularly interested in for our meta-analysis. So go ahead and do that. So today I want to talk to you about what CWB is, or counterproductive work behavior is shortened for CWB if you weren't familiar. The forms of CWB, causes of CWB, and just a little bit about the Bennett and Robinson scale that is the focus of our meta-analysis. All right, so first, what is CWB? CWB is defined as a voluntary behavior that harms or is intended to harm people in an organization or the organization itself. There are a few different structures that it can take, but the structure that the Bennett and Robinson scale follows and the structure that we're particularly interested in for our meta-analysis is a two-factor structure. So the two factors are first organizational deviance, and those are behaviors directed at the organization. For example, things like being late, maybe doing something to sabotage the organization, to bring it down, wasting time at work, not doing your work. Then there's interpersonal deviance, which is behaviors directed at employees. These can be things like insulting one of your fellow coworkers, spreading a rumor about them, excluding them from some sort of social activity. There are also some other factor structures just to be aware of. There's a five-factor structure. This was proposed by Spector and Fox. It includes things like production deviance, sabotage, theft, withdrawal, and abuse toward others. There's also even an 11-factor structure that was proposed by, I'm going to just try to say the name, Grease and Sackett. Hope that was something close. And those 11 factors include theft again, destruction of property, misuse of information, misuse of time and resources, unsafe behavior, poor attendance, poor quality work, alcohol use, drug use, inappropriate verbal action, and inappropriate physical action. Now that we know what CWB is and a little bit about the factor structure that it can take, let's now talk about the forms of CWB that you can see out in the workplace. So first we'll start with the organizational forms. And then absenteeism is pretty much what you would think, people not showing up to work. Particularly, researchers are concerned with unexcused absences because, if they have a good reason, then it's understandable and not really counterproductive. Absenteeism is often determined by both ability and motivation to attend. And some predictors include gender, where women tend to be absent more than men. There's also control policies which matter here. So if the organization does a lot to prevent absenteeism, or they have to turn in a lot of documentation when you're not at work to explain why, this can prevent that. Also, a culture of absenteeism will promote more absenteeism. Culture of not being absent from work will promote less absenteeism. Sabotage is a deliberate destruction or damaging of the organization's property or the work of organizational members. And then there's also production deviance, which is people either deliberately wasting time, doing their job poorly, or choosing not to follow directions. And then theft is pretty self-explanatory, but it's taking things from the organization that don't belong to you. And this one is particularly related to personality constructs. Then we also have some interpersonal forms of CWB that we often see in the workplace. probably the most common of which is workplace incivility. And this represents behavior that is rude or discourteous and generally violates shared societal norms for how people should be treated. The key with workplace incivility is that there's an ambiguous intent. The person is a victim of the incivility isn't always sure whether they were intended to be harmed or not. Another form of interpersonal CWB is social undermining. This can be a variety of behaviors that are intended to keep others in the workplace from developing favorable relationships, from being successful in their work, and from developing a favorable reputation. For example, social exclusion, being highly critical of others and spreading negative rumors may detract from a person's reputation and be considered social undermining. Then you have abusive supervision, which is again a variety of behaviors that uh, proceed to abuse subordinates at the hands of a supervisor. And some examples of this include being demeaning or condescending to subordinates, being overly critical of subordinates, and even taking credit for their work. Then you move on to something even more overt and serious like violence, which is physical acts of aggression carried out in organizational settings for the purpose of organizational psychology. A violent act could be directed at or instigated by a fellow employee, one supervisor, or even a customer. So it's not always just, coworker to coworker. And then finally, sexual harassment, which has a quite complicated definition because there's a whole legal component to this. But that definition is unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical contact when submission to the conduct is either explicitly or implicitly a term or condition of an individual's employment. Submission to or rejection of such conduct by an individual is used as a basis for employment decisions affecting that individual, and or such conduct has the purpose or effect of unreasonably interfering with work performance or creating an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. I didn't really know which one this one fit in, so I just kind of put it in its own slide. But there's also substance use. This is a commonly studied counterproductive work behavior, particularly when those things are abused. But employees who use alcohol and illicit drugs may tend to be more absent from work more frequently than others, and may be more likely than non-users to engage in just a variety of counterproductive work behavior. Seems almost more like a predictor to me, but apparently it's considered by some researchers to be a form of CWB. Now that I've talked to you about the forms, I'll talk to you now about what causes some of these forms and just CWB in general. So there are a couple of broad categories, starting with person-based causes. There's a few personality variables here that you see that can cause CWB, starting with low conscientiousness. As we see in a lot of the literature, conscientiousness is a predictor of many things, and CWB is no different. That's why you see a lot of integrity tests, which is kind of similar to conscientiousness, being used to predict CWB. And then, of course, high trait anger. That's going to be relative to a lot of the things against other people, but also the organization. So you're going to see that lead to stuff like, stealing or vandalism or sabotage or violence, certainly, and a lot of the interpersonal CWBs. Low self-control, so that just goes with a lot of negative behavior in general, and CWB is no different. High narcissism has been shown also to lead to CWB. I would suspect the other dark triad constructs would as well, but they just haven't been studied as much, so I haven't listed them here today. For situation-based predictors, a big one, although maybe not studied as much as these other ones, is opportunity. You've got to have the opportunity to even commit counterproductive work behavior. So if your organization is monitoring you a lot, you maybe don't have the opportunity if your job is just highly rule-based. But if you are given a lot of freedom, then you've got a lot of opportunity. Norms are important because that has to do with how commonly you see CWB committed in an organization. So if you're just a culture of people just constantly committing CWBs, then you're going to be more likely to commit them yourself and vice versa. Another predictor or cause that's been studied a lot is stress. When people are stressed out at their jobs, they're more likely to react to this kind of negative situation by being negative themselves and taking that out on the organization. And then injustice. So if they're mistreated by the organization, they're likely to blame the organization and retaliate by committing CWBs. So going along with that stress cause, here's one model of how stress can lead to counterproductive work behavior, and it also plays into those personal characteristics that can lead to it as well. So you've got some stressor in the environment. The individual makes an appraisal. They perceive it as being stressful. This leads to a negative emotion, and this negative emotion then leads to them committing counterproductive work behavior. And it's all moderated by their personality and their perceived level of control. So now that I've talked to you about some causes of counterproductive work behavior, let's look a little bit at the Bennett and Robinson scale that has been so commonly used to measure counterproductive work behavior. So just some general information about this scale. It's got 19 items in the full and final version. This includes 2 subscales, one of which is the organizational deviance factor that has 12 items with an internal reliability of 0.81. Then there's interpersonal deviance, which has 9 items and an internal reliability of 0.78. This is measured from 1 equals never to 7 equals daily. The other anchors include 3, which is twice a year, 4 several times a year, 5 monthly, and 6 weekly. I'm not sure what happened to 2, but it must have been like an error in the article. It wasn't there. Didn't tell me what 2 was. Just so we can see what some of these items are. Here's some examples. Here's actually the full list of interpersonal items. So you can see that a lot of the things that I talked about earlier with the different forms, a CWB, for example, made fun of someone at work, acted rudely towards someone at work, that'd be an incivility there. And then you can see also the organizational items. So you've got taken property from work without permission. There's stealing for you. Put little effort into work. That might be production deviance, you could say. Come in late to work, so tardiness. So it hits at many of the things that we talked about. So just to recap, because I went through quite a bit of things there in a short amount of time. So CWB is a voluntary behavior that harms or is intended to harm people in an organization or the organization itself. It is theorized to have 2, 5, or 11 factors. It has person and situation-based causes. It also has several forms, some of which include absenteeism, theft, and abuse. There are many scales that measure CWB, but the Bennett and Robinson scale is one of the most commonly used. and it's been featured in thousands of articles. I'm not sure if we want to wait till the end for questions, but if you'd like to ask a question now, I have this slide here. And then if not, here's my references.
I raised my hand.
Oh, okay. I can't see anything. Go
Oh,
ahead.
I don't know. Who can see that? I don't know who can see when hands are raised. Anyway, you can surely see this one coming. Women are more prone to absenteeism than men.
Yes,
Okay,
that's
let me follow up on this. What's the relationship between gender and conscientiousness?
I can't remember off the top of my head.
Well,
You
can one
know?
of you IO types answer?
I think women are better in consciousness. They have higher consciousness.
That'd be my guess. So what do you think is going on with this absenteeism thing?
Uh, let's see, the literature actually had a good explanation for this. I'm trying to remember what it said.
I don't think it's counterproductive work behavior. I strongly doubt that.
I cannot remember what it said. I think it had to do. I know some of it was how like women are perceived and treated at work, um, and then of course there's a number of reasons why they might be. They have to deal. Traditionally due to cultural, societal factors, dealing with things at home or taking care of the
That's
children
probably more
more.
like it. We're pretty much
Yeah,
trying to fit 10 pounds of potatoes into a 5-pound sack.
yeah. It's like
And every time some familial responsibility emerges, you usually can't plan them. You can't plan when your kid throws up before you're supposed to be coming into work, right? That's going to make you late, and it's not because you're trying to be counterproductive. It's because you've got this other conflicting value. So, I'm a little bit concerned about the way this has been portrayed in a decontextualized manner.
yeah, and so I think that also gets to excused versus unexcused absences that I mentioned earlier. So a
Yeah,
lot
but
of
what
those
ends up
reasons
happening?
would be excused and not really what researchers would be concerned
Well,
about. But
maybe. Maybe. I think it depends on the frequency of these things. But 5 pounds of potatoes aren't fitting in the sack. So it happens quite a lot. Now, fortunately, I'm in a profession where nobody really cares. But if I had some kind of office job, and we have had people in the front office who have had issues like this, I just think it's a contextual factor that needs to be considered in the interpretation of absenteeism. And even if you have a good reason, when you have a good reason 4 days a week, that becomes a problem.
yeah, I mean, typically, if you hire somebody, you want them to be at their job. So yeah, I mean, that's a whole nother thing, and it's a kind of a touchy subject. I mean, you can also get into, how in this country they don't give any mandatory maternity leave or anything like that, and then in some other countries they've got laws about that, and that's the culture giving that is much different. So that goes along with it too.
I think Maria had something to add. I saw it pop up in chat, but I didn't read it. But Maria?
Yeah, I can't see anything. I can end the
Um,
slideshow so I can see.
I was just gonna say that I think that like what you guys were sort of getting at was that voluntary versus involuntary absenteeism might come into play. So usually CWBs would require intent from the individual. They have the intention to sort of cause some harm. And so involuntary absenteeism would include those situations that Val was mentioning about life-related absences, like a child or other family member being ill that the individual would have to take care of. And that doesn't necessarily mean that that person is intending to be absent. It's just they have to be.
Right. So absenteeism isn't always counterproductive work behavior, but absenteeism in general has that as a large predictor. Any other questions? Discussion points?
I was wondering what this might look like in a virtual environment. So there's a lot of items about, doing things interpersonally, but we don't have, or a lot of us don't really have very much interpersonal relationships because we're working from home. Do you think there will be efforts to develop CWB measures perhaps that tap into the virtual aspect of work?
Uh, Probably, but that's going to be difficult. That's going to rely heavily on self-report, which can use and certainly can be a valid way to collect information on CWB, but it's just one form, and depending on the setting, people aren't always going to be that willing to tell you what they're misbehaving at work. So
One of the
unless
things
there's like
that
some kind of monitoring software, like if they're using a computer that's given to them by the company and has some sort of something that tracks what they're doing, but even that, they can't see what they're physically doing unless they're going to spy on them with a camera or something. So I don't know. It's just that's a kind of a tough thing to do.
One of the things that I've noticed in all of my zillion Zoom and WebEx meetings is increased problems with turn taking in conversation. In fact, it just happened
Yeah,
a
have a
second
problem with that
ago.
all the time.
So that and this is a rule or an issue in gender issue in the workplace where women typically have more problems in intruding in a conversation than men, or interjecting or taking their turn. And I've noticed that with remote activities, this problem, which wasn't very salient to me before, is very salient to me now. Now I can't tell if it's the remoteness or if it's just lags in the speech signal
I think it's
and
because
the
you can't
transmission.
see people that well.
Pardon me?
I think it's because you just can't see people that well. Like normally, if we were in a room, I would be able to see you. I'd be able to judge whether you're about to speak. I'd be able to look around.
Right.
Because I have this problem all the time on here. Like I speak right when somebody else is trying to speak too. Like we both just
Yep.
start speaking at the same time because we have no idea. We can't see each other. Even if your camera is turned on, if everybody has their camera turned on and there's too many people in the meeting room, it's hard to
Yep.
see the little tiles. Like
Yep.
that's just you just have no way of anticipating it, and so it's really tough.
So
Bothers me a
this is
lot
something,
too.
Alice, that I would look at. And the thing about this is it's actually something where you could actually get data. You could actually tape the meetings and analyze the turn taking behavior.
Yeah, that's a good point. You can just look at the recordings and take objective kind of instances of when somebody interrupted somebody or spoke at the same time.
That's probably reasonable to do if you're doing the experiment in your lab. I kind of think it's unlikely you're going to get those kind of recordings from businesses to make those kind of assessments.
Yeah, possibly. I don't know. It depends on the company or the nature of like the meeting. I don't know. I find data collection always to be getting access to data to be one of the toughest parts of the research. Any other questions or thoughts? Audit a bunch of grads, yeah. To get permission, but yeah. All right, well, if there's no other questions or thoughts, we can I can hand it over to Mark and he can tell you more about the logistics and kind of what we've been doing and what we're going to do in the future with this project.
Yeah, thanks, Mitch. Just give me one moment to get everything set up. Yeah, as Mitch said, let me know if you can share if you can see the screen. But yeah, as Mitch said, I'm going to be giving an overview of the process of this meta-analytic process. Before I jump into giving the roadmap for this presentation, I wanted to acknowledge Mitch and I's collaborators and give a shout out to Dr. Nathan Bowling, Dr. Tony Gibson, Russell Islam, Danny Jenkins, and Tyler Ryan for all their help and contributions to this project. So starting with the roadmap, I'm going to sort of cover the groundwork for this project, what our goals leading into this project were, and what are the early steps. Talk about the development of the inclusion criteria, so how we decide to include certain articles in the meta-analysis and exclude other articles. Give you all an update on the current state of the project, just tell you where we are, and then once I've described where we are, give some next steps. I'm going to give a description of what expectations we're going to be looking to test, what we're going to be looking to do to generate constructive validity evidence, and then we'll wrap it up with some questions. So starting with the groundwork, I'm going to cover the goals that we had going into the project and also the groundwork proper. So we had two big goals. Oh, this can probably be going into the project. We, being me and my collaborators, we wanted to investigate the contract validity of the Bennett and Robinson 2000 workplace deviance scale through meta-analysis as a method for doing that. And then, as sort of like a subordinate goal, we wanted to complete this investigation ideally by the 2021 SciUp annual conference submission deadline, so this fall. And then moving on to the groundwork. So we first decided that we were going to identify these articles through Web of Science. Using Web of Science, we found 1,089 total articles that had cited Bennett and Robinson 2000s. We then created a drive, one of my collaborators then data scraped all of these articles into a shared drive and spreadsheet. And once we got everything set and ready to go, we then started talking about the development of the included criteria. So I'm going to cover our initial criteria, sort of what we decided when we sat down before looking at any of the articles. Some later additions as we sort of came across some articles that prompted us to ask certain questions about the criteria, then also some notable decisions that we made as well. So inclusion criteria, again, this is the criteria that we're using to decide which articles we're going to include and exclude in our analyses. So when we first sat down, me and my collaborators, to discuss what the initial criteria was going to be for this project, we had two criteria. The articles had to use the workplace deviance scale in a study, and then the study had to use a worker sample in a field setting. Given that, as Mitch just described at length, that counterproductive work behavior is something that is observed and experienced at work. It's a workplace phenomenon. We wanted to make sure that any data that we're going to be using in this meta-analysis was from people who are actually working, who are out there experiencing this behavior, this construct at work, having a chance to. So anything like a student sample, any study using a student sample in this project would be excluded. Then as we started coding these articles, we encountered some unique situations that prompted us to ask certain questions. So the first of which is that we found a lot of articles that were not using the full scale. They were only using they were only using one of the two subscales. And then even if they used a subscale, often they would drop items, they would alter items, their situation. Maybe they would drop items, as I said before, because the authors didn't really see the items being too relevant to their study. So here's an example from Christian and Alice 2013. The researchers here used 10 items from the counterproductive work behavior directed at the organization subscale, the CWBO subscale. Normally the full scale has 12 items, and so they dropped 2 items because the researchers didn't really see it being too relevant to their study. Another example of researchers using a subscale instead of the entire scale is from Wu et al. 2013 here. In this example, in this research study, they only used the 7 items CWI subscale. And so we then talked about and decided that we could include these studies, but they had to use a full and unaltered subscales. We didn't want to be including altered scales because our original goals was to look at how the original, complete, unaltered scale is doing out there in the literature, the research literature. And additionally, we found a lot of articles were not available in English. This is one example, DePrez et al. 2019. While we do have some people, some collaborators of mine that are able to read non-English languages, we wanted articles that all of us could read, all of us could code, all of us could sort of check independently. So we decided to exclude articles that were not available in English. And then we also made a couple of other notable decisions as well that I want to share with you all. So we decided that articles that use translated skills, like this one from Kuiper et al. 2014, articles that use translated skills were okay to include, but we're going to make a note of it and account for it in our analyses. We're going to run analyses with these articles and without these articles to see if it makes a difference. So in this example right here, Kuiper et al., they use a procedure that we saw a lot of articles using where they translate the scale from English to a foreign language, in this case Romanian, then back to other translators. So there's two translators doing the work. They're independent, and they would then investigate that final product, the translation from the foreign language to English, to ensure that no meaning was lost, that it was correctly translated. And then additionally, we also found a lot of studies using informant ratings, other ratings, supervisor ratings, that sort of thing, non-self ratings. And we decided that we were going to include these articles as well. We're going to make a note of it, run these analyses with and without these articles to see if it makes a difference. Maybe include them as a moderator, stuff like that. So that's our inclusion criteria. And then moving on from that, I wanted to give an update of how far we've progressed in this project. So far, of the original 1,089 articles, we've coded around 684 of them. We've made decisions on 684 of them. Of these 684, 170 have met our inclusion criteria. And so, what are the next steps? Well, the next steps would be to investigate the iterated reliability of our coders through double coding. And then also would be to, once we were sure in our iterated reliability, would be to investigate the construct of validity through a Ontological Network of the Bannon-Robinson workplace deviance scale. And so the next steps, first off, we're going to be looking at the iterated reliability. And so I think in hindsight, this would be something that we would do a lot earlier to save us some work. Say if we find some discrepancies, we don't want to be going back and fixing those discrepancies. We'd rather do this proactively. But at some point, we're going to have all of us, each of the collaborators, code in an uncoded section of articles, and then we're going to do this to investigate the discrepancies and ensure the ratings are susceptible to bias. And then again, just as a review, iterated reliability, it describes the reproducibility of judgments across raters, the agreement in decisions across raters. So if we have 5 articles and all 6 of us code those articles as being excluded, that would have higher iterated reliability. And again, this allows us to investigate discrepancies and to ensure that all of our raters are sort of using the same schemas, the same cognitive frameworks to interpret and make decisions regarding these articles. So once we're sure of that our coding process went well, we're going to move on to the focal question, sort of building a nomological network with the Bannon-Robinson workplace deviance scale to investigate its contract validity, the scale's contract validity. So before I jump into that, I want to talk about what contract validation or contract validity is. So again, as you all know, psychological constructs are typically not directly observable. We can't just put a thermometer in someone's mouth and get a conscientiousness score. Constructs, we then capture these constructs indirectly through measures. But, and I have an example of this here on the right. So in the case of counterproductive work behavior, and then in the case of the workplace deviance scale, we're using, we can't capture the latent construct counterproductive work behavior directly. So we're using a scale and measure to indirectly get at it. But when we're using this Bannon-Robinson 2000 scale to capture counterproductive work behavior, we're making an inference that scale is capturing the latent trait counterproductive work behavior. We're inferring that it's capturing that trait. And then construct validity describes the evidence for that interpretation, and then using that measure as a measure of counterproductive work behavior. And then one way that we can generate construct validity evidence is through building an ontological network using that scale. So what's an ontological network? A ontological network allows researchers to examine whether or not a measure is appropriately relating to other measures. And so this is typically accomplished through using theory to generate testifiable predictions about how a measure of that construct should relate and will relate to other external variables. So in the context of the Bennett-Robinson 2000 workplace deviance scale, we would use, say, the theory of Bennett-Robinson and CODB in general to generate testifiable predictions concerning relations between this scale and other external variables. So for example, CWB and agreeableness, there's a long-standing, it's a well-established relationship between these two variables, specifically CWBO and CWBI. So counterproductive work behavior and CWBI have around a row of negative 0.46, and counterproductive work behavior, CWO and agreeableness have around a row of negative 0.32. These are well-established correlations. And so if the measure is working correctly, we would then predict that CWB would be negatively correlated with agreeableness, and that specifically CWBI would have a greater negative correlation than CWBO, and they should be around a moderate strength, so 0.3 to 0.46. And I just want to clarify these predictions. We haven't, as a group, as a project, generate these predictions yet. These are just some sort of examples of what we're looking to do there. I'm giving. And then once we have these predictions generated, we then test these predictions through examining the correlations between workplace deviance scale and other external variables. For example, we might be looking at organizational justice, OCB, job satisfaction, and other personality variables like conscientiousness and honesty, humility, to see if CWB is negatively correlated with those variables, and also looking at say like a stressor like interpersonal conflict or a job attitude like organizational constraints to see if CWB is positively correlated with those external variables. And then if CWB is exhibiting relationships that we would predict based on theory and past research, and that's pretty good construct validity evidence for the workplace deviance scale. And just to sum it up before I jump into the questions, I covered the groundwork, the goals of the project, the early stages of the project. I covered the development of the inclusion criteria, the initial criteria, some later additions that we made as a group of collaborators encountered articles and were coding articles, and then some notable decisions that we made as well. I gave an update on the current state of the project, and then I discussed some next steps. Any questions?
Yeah, I kind of have like a question and a half. I wanted to ask, this is both to Mark and Mitch. I know I've talked to both of you about this project a little bit, over the past several months. And I wanted to ask if there was kind of a particular aspect of this process that you liked. I know, personally, I think meta-analyses are pretty interesting and important. And I know it's a pretty interesting, criterion or scale that you're looking at. I was wondering if there were like particular studies that you enjoyed reading, or, just particular aspects of the actual method part of the meta-analysis you guys enjoyed.
Yeah, I'll jump on that first, if you don't mind, Mitch. So I actually had a prepared slide for this, coincidentally, that I was going to go into, but I decided not to in hindsight. So a big fun thing about this project was every time I went to code an article, it was like opening like a mystery box. Like I didn't know what I was going to be looking at. And I got to see all these different methods, all these different investigations, hypotheses, expectations, stuff like that. I got to see this wide range, diverse set of research, not only from different countries, from places like North Macedonia, Romania, the Canary Islands, but also using a diverse set of methods and ideas. And one study that I think exemplifies this is this study, which investigated workplace deviance through a qualitative analysis of Star Trek Into Darkness. I thought, I didn't know stuff like this existed, and so when I saw this, it was a real pleasant surprise, and it kind of opened my eyes a bit.
I think
Um,
Val has a question.
I was just going to finish answering
Oh, sorry.
Alex's question.
No, actually, I don't. My hand didn't
Oh.
get lowered.
All right.
Anyway, for myself, I'll be honest, as anyone who's ever done a meta-analysis, the phase that we've been in where you're just kind of sifting through the articles and then the part we're about to do with the coding is kind of the grunt work phase. So, but I guess the part that I can enjoy about that is once you have a really good sense about your criteria for inclusion and exclusion and you get comfortable going through the articles, then you can kind of do it almost automatically, and you can just kind of get into a flow state in a way, and you can kind of do it maybe while you're listening to music or have a show on in the background, and it can be kind of relaxing, I guess, in a way. But honestly, I look forward to when we get to the data analysis part more so.
Yeah, I want to echo what Mitch said. I've definitely experienced the flow state as well, and it's really nice that, say you're after like doing a whole day of work where you're reading through things, where you're doing writing, you're doing all this kind of hard trying work to kind of sit down and just, I don't want to say turn your brain off, because obviously you're using your brain, hopefully, to code these studies, but to do something a little bit less demanding and just relax, have some music in the background and just get into a flow.
I just want to mention anecdotally that there was a study in my lab that did not show a correlation between the state of flow and performance. What it's worth.
Well, it feels good.
It helps with my motivation, I'll tell you that.
Any other questions?
If we have no more question, we can stop here and we'll see each other next week. Thank you to the speakers.
Great job, guys.
Thanks, guys.